How important is it now that victims and families affected by domestic abuse come forward and help shape them?
Absolutely vital, I think. The law on domestic abuse needs to be a good law, and some of the people best positioned to comment on that and obtain a good law are victims who've experienced it themselves and experienced the law as it currently stands. We got over 2,500 people who signed the petition, so we're hoping that a large number of those will comment, and we'd invite anyone else interested in the subject to comment too, whether you're a victim or an expert or a member of family of a victim, or even a perpetrator and a member of family of a perpetrator. The more voices on this, the better chance we have of getting the best law.
We spoke off mic just before about how there's a certain density to this survey, and you've released a couple of tips and sort of a bit of a guideline for people sort of taking on this survey.
Yes, that's because we'd asked people to comment, and several people had come back a bit sort of daunted and panicked when they'd seen how much there is on the online hub, how much to read, how many questions and so on. And they asked for a bit of guidance. So we put together and sent it out as a petition update. A few tips such as you don't need to read everything that's there, you don't need to answer all the questions, you can pick and choose. If you just want to focus on the domestic violence, then there's just a few quick questions of introduction. And then you skip to domestic violence, and there's 6 questions there. And in fact, one of those questions seems to repeat the other, so possibly there's only 5 questions there. So it's really not as dense as it may appear at first. I am encouraged by the department as well that you don't need to stick to answering the questions. You can use the comments boxes to put down anything else that you have concerns about or you think should be in there that isn't, and any other comment related to domestic violence law.
So let's get into the survey a little. Currently, it stands as the Diversion of Offenders and Domestic Abuse Bill, but you are calling for domestic abuse to have it to become its own law in its own right.
At first, to be honest, I was just delighted that we're getting a law at all and that domestic abuse is in the title. But the more I think about it, the more I'm not happy about it being put together with the Diversion of Offenders, or with any bill indeed, but particularly with this one. There's several reasons for that. I think if you put 2 issues together in one law, that's just asking for sort of woolliness and confusion and watering down of both issues, really. I think it sends out the wrong message because domestic violence is a really, really important issue. It affects 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 women worldwide, and at least 1 in 6 men worldwide, including the Isle of Man. And I think as such a complex and important issue, it does deserve to be addressed with its own specific law. The Diversion of Offenders Bill is all about diverting people away from jail towards fines and cautions. And that just sits uneasily with the domestic abuse, because if you remember our petition, that was because someone had been fined rather than having a jail term, even though it had been a very serious assault. So we have been campaigning for an end of fines in domestic abuse. Victims find fines very insulting, and we don't really think it sends the right message to perpetrators or to society. So we've been pushing for sentencing to be more severe and to take domestic abuse seriously. So to be tied into a law that's kind of steering people away from jail just doesn't seem appropriate. So though, if you're asked question 11, do you think there should be a separate law? I do, and I hope others agree with me.
The proposed sets of legislation is modelled on the English law, which you believe has its shortcomings.
Yes. One warning sign, I suppose, about the English law is that it was enacted in 2015, and since then they've only had 8 successful prosecutions. So 8 prosecutions in 5 years for an offence that affects at least 1 in 4 people just seems pitiful to me. I and some of my colleagues from the charity recently attended a conference on coercive control in the UK, and there was a lot of discussion there about the shortcomings of the English law. Obviously, the lack of prosecutions was brought up as an issue, and reasons for that included lack of police training, lack of understanding of the law, lack of training of the courts. And again, you can have a law that's as good as you like, but if no one actually understands it or how to apply it, then it's not going to be effective.
Your personal stance is that the Manx legislation should be modelled on the Scottish one, and that basically looks at domestic abuse as a pattern of behaviour rather than just a set or series of incidents. So why do you think that this approach would be more forward-thinking and more beneficial to victims on the Isle of Man?
Yes. I'd just like to say I don't necessarily think it should be modelled on the Scottish law, but something more like the Scottish law, perhaps bringing in pieces of pieces from different laws. The Welsh law looks very good as well. But I don't know why we just have to copy the English, why we can't take a broader look and indeed just design something specifically for the Isle of Man that suits our situation. One of the main flaws that was discussed at the conference about the English law is the fact that it's incident-based, and that is quite an old-fashioned way of looking at domestic abuse. Current thinking and research shows that it's a pattern of behaviour that goes on for years. By the time, the old research used to say that people had usually suffered an average of 35 assaults before they reported it. Recent research suggests that number's now gone up to about 50 assaults before you report it. And it doesn't end when you leave, or indeed when someone goes to jail, because they can still find ways of threatening you from jail, and there's obviously going to become a day when they're out, and then it all starts again. So it needs to be looked at as the whole pattern that goes on for years and years. You in court, you're being asked to focus on one specific incident, or maybe a couple. Sometimes, usually in the English law, you can only be charged with a maximum of 10 assaults, which, like I say, bearing in mind you've already suffered 50 before you report at all, that's only a fraction of what's actually happened. But usually at different court appearances, that's brought down and down until maybe the person's only facing 1 or 2 charges. So that immediately reduces the crime that's being looked at, if you see what I mean, and the court isn't seeing the full picture and isn't understanding the cumulative effect of all those many, many assaults that have gone on and will go on unless something is done about it.
Like you mentioned before, that you campaigned for your petition on the basis that there'd be rigorous sentencing for domestic abuse offenders. The current maximum sentence for an offender on the island is 5 years, and that's question 10 alludes to this. Yeah. And do you think that's long enough?
No, mainly because that is a maximum. 5 years may be suitable in some cases, but I don't think we should limit ourselves to that, because a lot of the cases are attempted murder, and I think there should be potential for having much longer. I believe that the Scottish law has a maximum of 12 years. The question on the Isle of Man consultation asks whether you think that 5 years is long enough, but then it gives you 3 different options to select as to what you think might be an appropriate sentence. And I think it goes up to 14 years on the Isle of Man options.
So for victims and families affected by domestic abuse, and anyone who wants to stand in solidarity and help shape this bill to what's appropriate to the Isle of Man, where can they access it, and what are you recommending?
It's on the Isle of Man Government Consultation Hub. You can find the link on, if you can't find it by Googling, which you should be able to, you can find it on our website, on our Facebook page, or on the petition update that I've sent out. It's quite easy to work your way through that hub to find the domestic abuse bill. You just have to scroll down, but be aware that it is called diversion of offenders. And initially it comes under criminal justice, so you may not find it immediately if you're looking for domestic abuse. But once you get there, like I say, you have to fill out the introduction, and then you can just go to the 6 questions. But please use the space for any comments. If you're a victim with an experience on the Isle of Man, use the opportunity to tell your story and your experience so that our legislators will understand how people are being let down at the moment and why this law is so important.